Hello, everybody, and we are here to talk about the Tower of Babel. And I've spent a lot of time with this. I'm really excited about it. We're going to look at the history of the tower and some modern archaeology. And we've used AI to give us some very realistic images to help us understand and maybe get an idea of what it was like. You can see that here in our title slide in the background. Using archaeology, using modern excavations, and all the information that we have, AI can take that information and give us some visuals to help. So let's get started. The Tower of Babel, its history and modern archaeology. People have painted this in the past, and they actually were pretty close in some of their renderings. Here's Peter Bruegel from 1563, his rendition. He had a contemporary, a man named Lucas, in 1594, and not bad, but just of historical interest to show you. Let's begin our journey, however, with Josephus. Josephus, remember, is the famous Jewish historian from the first century, right after the time of Jesus and the fall of Jerusalem. And he writes in Antiquities 143 about Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. And it says, "Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardness to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, soon higher than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, the thickness, and it was so strongly built that thereby its great height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. In other words, it was giant. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar made of bitumen or pitch, that it might not be liable to admit water." That kind of made it waterproof. "When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not growing wiser by the destruction of former sinners." In other words, they didn't learn from the flood. "But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through the multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another." He goes on to say, "The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon." This will be important because it's going to place the tower in Babylon that was relevant in the time of Josephus and in the Bible, because of the confusion of that language which they had readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel confusion. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower and of the confusion of the language when she says thus, "When all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they would thereby ascend up to heaven. But the God sent storms of wind and overthrew the tower and gave everyone his peculiar language. And for this reason, it was that the city was called Babylon. But as to the plain of Shinar in the country of Babylonia, Hestius mentions it when he says thus, 'Such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter and came to Shinar of Babylonia.'" This is important here because Josephus is talking about Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, and he's mentioning two more ancient historians who are secular, not Jews, who are corroborating the story in their writings. Sibyl was a female ancient kind of pagan writer, or a series of writers from the Greek, and then we have Hestius, also a Greek historian. So again, just showing you that 2,000 years ago, when Josephus wrote, he believed that the story was true, of course, and he is calling on ancient historians and their writings to corroborate the story. If we look at one of these Sibylline oracles, which is preserved from about 200 BC, It says, "But when the judges of the great God came upon men, when they attempted to build a great tower to ascend into heavens, the winds quickly cast down the great tower. Then mortals received different languages, and the whole earth was filled with nations. And for this reason, the city was called Babylon." So that's the actual quote. That's just what Josephus quoted. But there's others. There's a historian named Berosus, and he wrote in 280 BC. He was a Babylonian priest of the god Marduk. He was writing in Greek around 280 BC. His history of Babylon was called Babylonica. And Eusebius in his Chronicon, in a fragment of Polyhistor, quotes Berosus. And Josephus also quotes Berosus in his Antiquities quite a bit on different subjects like the flood. And so, again, another ancient historian is recording what they have been learned from history. And look what he says: "The first inhabitants of the earth, glorying in their own strength and size and despising the gods, undertook to build a tower whose top should reach heaven at the place where Babylon now stands." Again, placing it there. This is going to be important as we go further. "But when it approached heaven, the winds assisted the gods and overthrew the work upon its builders. Its ruins are said to be still at Babylon. The gods then introduced a diversity of tongues among men." So again, he's placing it in Babylon, which we'll see is important when we get to the archaeology. What's really interesting, and he's one of the most important ancient commentators on the Tower of Babel, is that look how what he said lines up with the Bible. Men built the tower to heaven, Genesis 11:4. Divine intervention, Genesis 11:5. The tower destroyed, some kind of implied judgment, although that's not in the Bible, that the tower was destroyed. The languages were confused, Genesis 11:7, and the location of Babylon, Genesis 11:9. All of that will line up, as we'll see. Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, when he captured Babylon, and he had ordered repairs to Etemenaki. And we'll see that that is the remnant of the Tower of Babel that was rebuilt, because he had destroyed the city, but his death prevented its reconstruction. Herodotus is a very famous ancient Greek historian. He wrote about 425 BC. You can see that in his histories 1.178 to 216. Let's read 181, which is a description of the sacred precinct and tower that existed in Babylon at the time. He's talking about what the remnant of the Tower of Babel was that was in Babylon at this time. "In the middle of the precinct there was a tower of solid masonry, a furlong in length and breadth, upon which was raised a second tower, and on that a third, and so on up to 8. The ascent to the top is on the outside by a path which winds around all the towers. When one is about halfway up, one finds a resting place and seats, where persons are wont to sit sometime on their way up to the summit. On the topmost tower there is a spacious temple, and inside the temple stands a couch of unusual size, richly adorned with a gold table by its side. There is no statue of any kind set up in the place, nor is the chamber occupied of nights by anyone but a single native woman, who, as the Chaldeans, the priest of this god, affirm, is chosen for himself by the deity out of all the women of the land." So in his summary, Herodotus talks about the structure, multi-tiered, 8 stages, built of solid masonry, and it has an external spiral ascent. The architecture, that its resting platforms has midway up, and there's a temple shrine at the top, and that it had a religious function. There was a sacred bed and table, there was a priesthood, and there were ritual sacrifices and incense. And there's an associated cult that he mentions. We didn't get into that. The Temple of Zeus Belus, the Greek identification of the god Marduk, which we'll see directly fits with what we learn from other ancient sources. Now let's turn to some people that are well known and mentioned in the Bible and how this will help us. And this is also some really interesting Bible archaeology for those of you who are Bible students of the Old Testament. Sennacherib Prism from 689 BC in Assyria. Sennacherib, as you may recall, is the king of Assyria, and he started his reign around 705 BC. In 701 BC, there's a very famous biblical event where he invades the kingdom of Judah. It's described in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah. I have the references there for you. And he basically comes and surrounds the city, and that's when God supernaturally intervenes after King Hezekiah lays out the letter from Sennacherib before him in the temple, and an angel of the Lord comes and destroys them all. So go and read that. That's not really relevant to our text, but that's the story. And all of that is described. A lot of this biblical event is described in this prism. But what's relevant for us is in 689 BC, when Babylon was destroyed, it's recorded in this prism. The city and its houses I destroyed. The temple of its gods I demolished. Babylon I turned into a ruin of heap and debris. And he was later killed in 681 BC, which is also recorded in the Bible. You can look at those references there in 2 Kings and Isaiah. So there were temples there in Babylon that he's referencing to its gods, and he's saying he demolished them. This is important because his son, who succeeded him, is also mentioned in the Bible as Herodon. He's his son. He began the rebuilding of Babylon, and he has a prism written in Akkadian where he describes the temples of Babylon, which had fallen into ruin, I restored. I rebuilt Esagila and its sanctuaries. Esagila is basically the temple complex of Babylon right along the river there where all of its ancient monuments and temples and major buildings were. It's like an entire complex area, and he says he began to rebuild it, and that was around 681 to 669. Again, he was another king of Assyria. Well, if we go about 70 years later to 620 BC, Nabopolassar has a cylinder called the Etemenaki cylinder, and it's written in Akkadian cuneiform. And as we'll see, the Etemenaki is their name for what the remnant of the Tower of Babel was that they were still using and rebuilding. So he was king of Babylon 626 to 605 BC. So we've switched now over, you remember, from the kings of Assyria to Babylon, because the kings of Assyria had come in and destroyed it. Now we have the kings in Babylon that are going to start rebuilding as well. He's the father of Nebuchadnezzar, the famous Babylonian king from the book of Daniel. This is one of the clearest ancient references confirming that the tower already existed. It had fallen into ruin, and that he began rebuilding it. And he has his own little cylinder here, again in Akkadian, and this reads, Etemenaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, which before my time had become dilapidated and fallen into ruin, I laid its foundation in the bosom of the netherworld and raised its summit towards heaven. So he really began to repair it. If you want to read the entire script, you can pause this slide here. I'm not going to read it, but this is everything that we have written from him on this cylinder. It's been translated. I have a few relevant things in yellow. First, note that it starts at the time my lord Marduk told me in regard to Etemenaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, which before my day was very weak and badly buckled to its ground, to its bottom, on the breast of the netherworld, to make its top via the heavens. So he's naming it Etemenaki. He's saying that he's going to rebuild it. And then notice down there a little further, Nebuchadnezzar, my firstborn son. This is going to be important because Nebuchadnezzar is going to continue the rebuilding of this structure. Now, when we get to Nebuchadnezzar, again, the famous guy from the Bible, the king of Babylon in the book of Daniel, there is something called the Tower of Babylon stele. This is the most famous piece of archaeology. You can see a picture of it over here on your right. We have in this a visual depiction of the Babylon ziggurat. It's in that top section there. I'm going to blow it up and show you, don't worry. There's an inscription describing its rebuilding in the bottom right. There's an architectural plan of the summit temple. You can see it. It is the closest ancient image we have of the Babylon ziggurat. The relief shows a 7-tier ziggurat, a temple shrine at the summit, a square plan of the temple, and Nebuchadnezzar holding architectural tools. So here on the left is the entire stele. Stele is just a fancy archaeological term for a piece of stone with engravings on it. And you can see at the top there's Nebuchadnezzar, and at the bottom right you can see some writing. Now, if we look to the right here, here's the blown up portion of the top portion. You can see Nebuchadnezzar there on the right, and then you can see the image of the tower, the ziggurat there that was in Babylon at the time. Let's show just that and blow it up a little bit more. And if we then take a diagram and put it next to it, it's a little bit easier to see what exactly this showed when it was all put together, and you put the two pieces of stone together and do a relief of it. So there's clearly a 7-tiered tower with a temple at the top, and there's Nebuchadnezzar next to it. Here's also what archaeologists have reconstructed there, putting that into writing as a diagram. Now, if we look here, we blow up the bottom portion of the stone. It was split in two, as you can see. You can see that writing there. That is the Akkadian cuneiform writing, and it's been translated. Etemenaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, which before my time have become low, its summit I raised towards the heaven. People of many lands carry bricks and baskets upon their heads for the building of that temple. So here's Nebuchadnezzar himself, not only showing the ziggurat, but also talking about its rebuilding. Well, he has some more writings, again in Akkadian, on a cylinder. This is called the Nebuchadnezzar II Etemenaki cylinder. And this has been translated. And look what he says. Etemenaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, which before my time had become dilapidated and fallen into ruin, I rebuilt and completed. I raised it up to the heavens. I laid its foundations upon the breast of the netherworld. With bitumen and baked brick, I constructed it. I assembled the peoples of many lands, and they carried the bricks and baskets upon their heads. I made it shine like the sun. Those materials, realize brick and bitumen, match exactly the description of Genesis 11:3. So Nebuchadnezzar finished the rebuilding of this temple, which had been in existence all the way back even prior to the kings of Assyria, which had originally destroyed it. So we're building a historical basis that there was this temple there that had been there a long time, that had fallen into ruin, which had been destroyed and then rebuilt. Here's one of the bricks that has been found in Babylon, and it is inscribed there with Nebuchadnezzar's name. So we know that this is a brick that Nebuchadnezzar made, and there are many of them there. So if we want to summarize what we've seen so far, is that we had in 689 BC, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, he went and destroyed it. Esarhaddon, his son, then started to restore it, and he was another king of Assyria. Then we switched to Babylon, where we have Nabopolassar. He began rebuilding it, and his son Nebuchadnezzar completed the monument. Okay? Now, there is also a tablet called the Esagila tablet. And remember that Esagila is the name for that whole complex of worship and gods and deities that they had in Babylon, the famous giant city at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and going all the way back, probably to the Tower of Babel. There's this area there where all these different buildings were. And this is called the Esagila tablet. It's a copy, so it's dated 229 BC, but it's going back to a description from 590 BC. and it's a cuneiform tablet from Uruk. It's a copy of an older text, as I just told you, from 590, which would be the time of Nebuchadnezzar. It was translated in 1876 by Assyriologist George Smith. It gives the height of the tower as 15 nidan, which is 91 meters, with a square base of 91 meters on each side. That's about 27 to 30 stories tall, depending which, how big your stories are. The stories of the early part of our century were smaller, and today they are somewhat taller. Here's what it reads. Etemenaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, its length is equal to its width. Its base measures 15 nidon by 15 nidon. It raises in 7 stages. The total height corresponds to the same measure. And a nidon, we have figured out, is about 6 meters or 20 feet. So 15 nidon is about 91 meters. This is really, really quite tall. So this is fascinating in that now we have its actual dimensions. Now remember, this is at the time that it was rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, but it's the foundation and everything probably did not change from the time of Babel. Just to put it in perspective here, I'm going to give you 2 timelines. We have the flood. Babel was built maybe around 2242, and then Nebuchadnezzar here in the far right was around 605 to 562 BC. So it's about 1600 years later that it's being rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, just to give you a little bit of an idea of time of how long that is. Here's another timeline that has the history of Israel, and in it you can see from the Tower of Babel all the way through those different histories of the part of Israel, the Exodus, the patriarchs, the judges, the time of the kings. By the time we get to the end of the time of the kings, which is when Nebuchadnezzar came and rebuilt this, that's about 1600 years. So let's now begin to try and link these 2 sites from Babylon in the time of Nebuchadnezzar to the Tower of Babel. So if we look at Genesis 10:10, and when it's talking about Nimrod, it says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So they left the ark, they came down the mountain, they settled in the Fertile Crescent because it's got water, it's fertile, it's great to grow things and have crops. And Babylon, as you may know, is built right along the river Euphrates there. In Daniel, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. So we have, again, another direct link and reference that Babylon, where Babel was in the land of Shinar, is the same place where Nebuchadnezzar was. A direct link there. So how do we now locate the Tower of Babel site? So you've seen we have a long history from Sennacherib to Nebuchadnezzar talking about this ancient site, which was pre-existent and had become dilapidated. That the Tower of Babel stele says it had a large square base, 91 by 91 meters. Archaeology at the Esagila complex area, which remember is the ancient Babylon temple and city area. If you look in that region there from above, there is a very large square area there. And now it's got some water in it. I'll show you a picture of that there. So when they began to look at this was excavated by Robert Caldaway. He uncovered a foundation measuring exactly the same size, 91 by 91 meters. It's almost exactly predicted by the tablet. Then they dug and found some clay bricks and a foundation base. And so this is an exact match, and that's why most scholars are very confident, Answers in Genesis, many other people, that this is the temple of Etemenaki at Babylon. And because it's linked to the Tower of Babel through its exact location, it was the remnant of it at that time that was rebuilt. Just to show you where this is, here's a satellite image of where we are, where Babylon is. As we go in there, you can see the river Euphrates, and the yellow star is going to be where this temple complex is. Here's a diagram of that temple complex. If we put the satellite image next to it, you see that they correspond, and they've done a lot of archaeology in this area. Here's a blow up of the foundation area that they have found. This is a AI generated to scale approximately of how big that foundation was. It was huge, about 25 to 30 stories in height would have been the foundation that they built for this square 91 by 91 meters. Here's a modern diagram of this Essagia complex. You can see that we have the ziggurat of Etemenanke, the remnant of the Tower of Babylon there, and there's some other temples. You've got the city wall and all the various gates. So this encompassed both sides of the river, and we know that the ziggurat was kind of right there in the middle. Here's some renditions of it. We can see there on the left the Etemenanke, or the Tower of Babel as its remnant was. And we have the Ishtar Gate. We have some courtyards. Here's another view. There was a temple just south of that, the Nebu Temple. And you can see it was a very large religious area. And they had kind of the temple to the god, and then the idea of the Etemenanke, or the Tower of Babel structure, is that's a way for the god to kind of come down and be with the man. So they were both related. Here's another view from a slightly more aerial view showing this Esagila complex. So if we look, what do we know about this latter Tower of Babel at Babylon? Well, we know, interestingly, that Etemenanke means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Again, the same principle, the same idea of that they were trying to reach to the heavens with this tower as a way to communicate with their gods. It was dedicated to their god Marduk. It symbolized a cosmic mountain, a stairway between heaven and earth, a place where the god could descend to earth. At the top was a shrine for Marduk. Ancient texts say the god was believed to rest there at night. Excavations at this site, as I've told you, found massive mud brick foundations of bitumen and mortar, and a fired brick facing, and again, stamped bricks from Nebuchadnezzar, exactly paralleling what we have talked about. If we keep going, it was 90 by 90 by 90 meters. Really big, 300 feet high, about 25 to 30 stories. People have estimated how many mud bricks this must have taken. The total mud bricks, as we're going to see, there's two types. The mud bricks, or the ones that are on the inside, they're not fire kilned, about 30 to 36 million. They formed the inner structure. They were faster and cheaper. And the fired bricks on the outside for facing and ramps, those are ones that would be more waterproof and more sturdy, about 10 to 15 million of them. They were to protect it from the water and the elements. So the combined estimate is a staggering 40 to 50 million bricks to build this tower. Now remember, this is the tower that stood at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know that that's the same dimensions exactly as the Tower of Babel as it stood when it was originally made, but the foundation probably did not change, so it's probably actually pretty close, but we don't know. We're basing it upon what we've learned from what was at the time of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon around 590, 600 BC, 1600 years later, as I showed you. But it's big, it's massive. Just to give you a size comparison here we have the Tower of Babel. is a little smaller than the Great Pyramid, and there you can see the Eiffel Tower and the Empire State Building for comparison. So it's really, really big. Let's talk a little bit about these bricks since there's so many of them. Remember from Genesis 11, and it's highlighted there in yellow, it says they had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. So in this area, there must not have been stone that they could mine, and they wanted to be able to build things as quickly as possible. So they made bricks, and they got bitumen or pitch or so-called asphalt for the mortar. And here's a picture. You can see the Akkadian writing there with the bricks, and you can actually see to this day the pitch and bitumen or asphalt mortar that's keeping the bricks together, kind of like we use today. As we discussed, there were two different kinds of bricks that they found. You can see there's the outer fire kiln bricks. Those were the ones that were more waterproof, more sturdy, and then the inner mud bricks. The inner mud bricks were much faster to make. You didn't have to put them in the fire, only have them dry in the sun, but they weren't as sturdy. So they were faster and cheaper. Here's a little illustration just showing the making of the two. You basically, got your mud, you mixed it with water, you put it in a mold, and then you let them dry in the sun for the mud ones. For the fire-killed ones, you did the same thing, except they had a little bit thicker mud and they were a little harder to make, but then you had to put them in a fire kiln for up to 1 to 2 days is what they think. So they kind of were, it was a slow heat and baking process. They would then get the bricks, and they would use the bitumen applied as mortar, kind of like we use as modern cement. They would put them in between to hold them together. And here's how they did it a little bit. We think we have the natural bitumen coming from pits. It was heated. It was mixed with some sand and clay sometimes, and then it was put in as the mortar between the bricks. You can see that as it goes from 1 to 2 to 3, and then in a finished wall, it would be pretty well sealed. So really interesting, but the fascinating thing to think about is this must have been a major undertaking to make that many bricks. I mean, they had to have a very large setup to make that many bricks with a lot of workers. People have figured out if one worker could produce 150 to 200 bricks per day, then producing 40 million would require, depending if you had 1,000 workers, 200 years, 5,000 workers, 40 years, 10,000 workers, 20 years. A long, long time. So that's really what we know about the Tower of Babel and its history and its archaeology. Unfortunately, none of it remains today. Now, let me show you something that's related and really interesting from Ur, where we know Abraham came from, because there stands a ziggurat, which is still in existence and has the same type of architecture, and it's one of the best ones preserved in the entire world. Remember that Abraham came from Ur. Ur, as you see on the map there, is south of Babylon by a couple hundred miles. And he came from there up and stayed in Haran and then went down into the Promised Land. There was a famous ziggurat there to the moon god, which I'll show you. This mound was found in the 1800s. You can see it's largely covered by sand there, and then it began to be excavated. But that's what it looked like when they first found it. The ziggurat at Ur, the remains were rediscovered by William Loftus in 1850. The first excavations were conducted by John Taylor in the 1850s, leading to the identification of the site as Ur. After World War I, preliminary excavations were performed by a couple people, and the site was extensively excavated in the 20s by Sir Leonard Woolley of the University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum up until 1934. There are some pictures of them. You can see they've gotten a lot of the sand off of it. Here it is standing today. Now that's had some reconstruction done to it, um, but it's quite a large structure. It's very big, as I showed you. Not nearly as big as the Tower of Babel, but it gives you some idea of what they were capable of. This ziggurat at Ur was built by King Ur-Nammu, who dedicated it in honor of Nana or Sin, which is a moon god. And that's going to be very interesting as I show you in approximately the 21st century during the third dynasty of Ur. The massive step pyramid measured 200 feet in length, 148 in width, and 98 feet in height. The height is speculative as only the foundations of the ziggurat have survived, but they can kind of tell based upon the base and everything. The ziggurat was a piece in a temple complex that was an administrative center for the city, and again, it was dedicated to the moon god Nana, and that was the patron deity of this city. Here's another picture showing the modern area that you can go see it. Again, they've reconstructed some of this for historical reasons. And the ziggurat at Ur was also made of mud bricks from mud and reed and baked in the sun. And they baked the bricks from, again, this clay pressed into mold. Some of them are up to 30 pounds in size. There you can see one on the right with the inscriptions on it, just like the ones that Nebuchadnezzar made thousands of years later. They're very similar. They kept the same technology. They think that this ziggurat had about 7 million mud bricks and about 1 million of the baked or kiln-fired clay bricks for the outside. And again, many of those bricks are stamped with the name of King Ur-Nammu on it, as you can see there. This compares the structure of the ziggurat of Ur to the Tower of Babel. So it's about a third smaller, but still quite big. If we look at another comparison, 40 to 50 million versus 8 million bricks. Now, what gets interesting is that the Tower of Babel is about 2247 BC. We can really place that extremely accurately because of the genealogies and time frames given in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. From the time of that to this ziggurat at Ur is about 147 years later. Now, what really makes that interesting is that here is Babylon and Ur, and so 147 years later, after the dispersion, we know that Abraham was there and his family, that they despite what happened at Babel, they started building these structures again. Now, granted, they weren't as tall. Maybe they weren't trying to reach the heavens, but they were doing it again, not that much long later, only 147 years later. This big structure is there at Ur. So they have remember, they were dispersed all over the world. Shem and his line stayed in this vicinity, which would include Abraham, who gets called out. Let me show you this. This is a timeline that I've made from the Ark to the Tower of Babel and all the genealogies that we have and their ages as given in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. And there you can see the Tower of Babel around 1758 after creation. And then if we put where the ziggurat at Ur would be, we could see would be in the days of Terah before Abraham was born. About 150 years later is when this temple was erected. It's actually 147, right? So let's blow it up. 147 years later, after the Tower of Babel, they were making these temples again. Now remember that this temple was dedicated to the moon god, Nana or Sin. We don't know who the original Tower of Babel was dedicated to. Remember, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it was Marduk, so they changed its use. What do we know about this moon god? Well, we know that the ziggurat at Ur was dedicated to the moon god Nana or Sin. Nana is the Sumerian name for the Mesopotamian moon god, who is also known as Sin or Suin in later religious texts. It's one of the oldest gods in the Mesopotamia, first mentioned around 3500 BCE and worshipped until the 3rd century AD. Long time of worship to this moon god. He is associated with cattle herds, the prosperity of the lower Euphrates, reeds, marshes, and wisdom. He is said to control the rise of waters, the growth of reeds, the increase of herds, and bestow fertility and prosperity on the cow herds. And then his emblem is the crescent, which is sometimes represented by bull's horns. Here is one of the bricks from the temple or the ziggurat at Ur, again, where Abraham and his family were 147 years later after the Tower of Babel. And on that brick, it records the building of the temple for Nana, the moon god, and the fortification of the city of Ur. It was a brick of Ur-Nammu the king. And there's the Akkadian, there's the brick, and you can read the translation there at the bottom where it talks about the for Nana, you can see that it says the moon god. And this gets really interesting because of its relation to Islam and the moon god that they worship today. They call him Allah. This is evidence that this moon god was around much, much later. Look what it says in Judges 8:21. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength." So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. And Judges 8:26, now the weight of gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were around the camel's neck. So here, in the time of the Judges, much, much later, they are still worshiping the moon god with these crescent ornaments. And you can see in the top right there, the crescent for the moon god Nana there. Even in Isaiah, which is much, much later, Isaiah is about 600 BC. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery, the jingling anklets, the scarves, and the crescents. Here's some archaeology showing us some of these inscriptions to the moon god, and you can see the crescent there. And what's really interesting, compare on the left, the crescent at the top of a large tower raising to the sky. That's exactly what Islam uses today. Many of them also have a star. You can see 2300 BC and 2024 AD, or now it's 2026. I made this particular slide a while ago. So a fascinating connection to Islam going all the way back to the time of Abraham. So now we can see that Islam is, not a new god or a new religion that was revealed by Muhammad several hundred years after Jesus, but an ancient false deity going all the way back to the time of Abraham. And he was called out of that pagan religion. So that's the history of the Tower of Babel and its linkage to Abraham. I hope you enjoyed this. Hit the like button if you did. Thank you and have a good day.